I told that room everything. About Mia, 19 years old, raising his child alone in Austin while he toasted champagne in a borrowed tuxedo. About the second child, Ethan, in the front row in his own mother's arms, a woman who had been my wife. I laid the documents on the table. Clinic records, birth certificates, a timeline of destruction this man had left behind him like a trail of ash. Ashley's bouquet hit the floor. The ring came off her finger and struck his chest. Raymond Hargrove's glass shattered against the tablecloth. And Connor, charming, calculated, untouchable Connor, sank to his knees on that polished floor, stripped of every lie that had held him upright. I pulled the replica gun from my jacket, let the room freeze, then opened the chamber and showed them what was inside. Nothing. My name is Daniel Foster, and if you had asked me a year ago whether my life could fall apart in a single season, I would have laughed. I was a tenured history professor at a respected university in Austin, Texas. My days followed a comfortable pattern. Morning lectures, faculty meetings, dinner at home, weekends with my family. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. My wife, Carla, had always been a force of nature. I met her during my early years as a graduate teaching assistant. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and rearranged its energy without even trying. She sat front row in every session, asked the boldest questions, and challenged ideas that other students simply accepted. I told myself repeatedly that I would remain professional, and I did, right up until the semester ended and the boundary no longer existed. What followed was a whirlwind that neither of us planned, but both of us dove into head first. One dinner led to another. Conversations ran past midnight. Chemistry that defied logic slowly became something I mistook for destiny. When Carla finally brought me home to meet her family in Charleston, I understood just how different our worlds were. Her father, Raymond Hargrove, was the sort of man who wore authority like a second skin. A prominent corporate attorney with deep roots in old Southern society, he assessed me in less than 30 seconds and found me lacking. I was a liberal arts academic with modest savings and no family name worth mentioning. He had envisioned someone else entirely for his daughter, a country club professional, someone whose ambitions matched the Hargrove legacy. I was none of those things, and he never bothered to hide it. That weekend ended badly. After a bruising argument with her father, Carla made a decision that would shape the next 2 decades of our lives. She packed a bag, walked out of the Hargrove estate, and turned to me in the car with fire in her eyes. "Do you still want me?" she asked. I said yes without hesitation. 2 hours later, we were exchanging vows in front of a county clerk in Austin, with no guests, no ceremony, and no blessing from her family. Raymond made good on his disapproval immediately. The Hargroves cut Carla off completely. No calls, no visits, no acknowledgement when our daughter Mia was born. That silence was its own kind of sentence. Carla wore the estrangement like a badge of honor, calling it freedom. And for a while, I believed her. But freedom and recklessness are not always the same thing, and as the years passed, the line between the two blurred in our marriage. Carla never softened. She approached every disagreement as a battle, every compromise as a surrender. What had once felt like passion gradually revealed itself as something more restless, more self-serving. By the time Mia turned 19, I had grown used to the quiet tension in our home, the kind that never quite explodes, but never truly settles either. I told myself we were fine. That was my first and most costly mistake, because while I was busy convincing myself that our life was stable, something underneath it was already crumbling, and I was the last person in the house to notice. Mia had always been the brightness in our home. Even as a teenager, when most young people retreat behind walls of silence and eye rolls, she remained curious and warm, the kind of daughter who still talked to her father about her day. When she turned 19 and expressed her desire for independence, I felt nothing but pride. I arranged a summer position for her at the university bookstore, thinking it would give her a taste of professional life in a familiar environment. She loved it almost immediately. She talked about the rhythm of the store, the steady flow of students, the small satisfaction of earning her own money. For the first few weeks, her reports home were full of energy and optimism. Then, toward the end of June, a name started appearing in her stories: Connor Walsh. Connor was a third-year law student, tall, well-dressed even in summer heat, with the kind of measured confidence that made people trust him before they had any reason to. To Mia, he represented sophistication and maturity. She was 19 and impressionable, and he knew exactly how to position himself as worldly in her eyes. I noticed him on the 2 occasions I stopped by the bookstore. He had a particular way of occupying space near Mia that I recognized immediately, leaning slightly too close, making sustained eye contact, performing attention in a way that was calculated rather than genuine. I had spent years observing young people in academic settings, and I had seen that particular performance before. It rarely ended well. I raised my concerns at home one evening over dinner. Mia was enthusiastic about Connor, and I tried to express my hesitation calmly. I pointed out the age gap, the power imbalance that naturally exists when an older graduate student pursues an undergraduate. I expected Carla to support me, or at least engage with the concern seriously. She didn't. She waved it off, said Connor seemed respectable, and suggested I was being overprotective. Her ease in dismissing my worry stung in a way I didn't fully understand at the time. I clenched my jaw and let the conversation move on, but something settled in my chest, a low, steady unease that I would carry for weeks without being able to name it. Mia and Connor dated through July. She was happy, in the way that only first real love can produce, slightly distracted, frequently smiling, always with her phone nearby. I watched and waited, trying to give her the space to make her own choices, while remaining close enough to catch her if she fell. The fall came in early August. One Friday evening, I returned home to the sound of crying from upstairs. Mia's door was shut, but she opened it when I knocked. Her face was swollen and raw. Connor had ended things without explanation, with a message so brief it bordered on cruel. She collapsed into me in the hallway, and I held her for a long time, saying nothing because nothing adequate existed. When I went downstairs and told Carla what had happened, she raised an eyebrow and said that perhaps it was for the best. The indifference was so complete that I stood in our kitchen afterward feeling more alone than I had in years. This was the moment I began to understand that something was deeply wrong, not just with Connor and not just with Mia's heartbreak, but with the very center of our family. The days after Connor left Mia behind were some of the hardest I had witnessed as a parent. She didn't bounce back the way young people are supposed to. The light that had characterized her all her life seemed to dim week by week, replaced by something heavier and quieter. She stopped eating properly. At breakfast, she would push food around her plate without enthusiasm, sometimes abandoning it entirely. She lost weight visibly over the course of 2 weeks, her clothes hanging slightly looser, her cheekbones more prominent, the color fading from her face. I contacted her supervisor at the bookstore and offered soft excuses for her absences. The truth was that she was barely able to get through a day without dissolving. I kept waiting for Carla to step in, not because I was unwilling, but because I believed Mia needed her mother in a way that I, as her father, simply could not replicate. There are things that a daughter shares with her mother that no father fully reaches, and I thought perhaps Carla could access a part of Mia's grief that remained beyond my reach. But Carla showed no interest. When I asked her to speak with Mia, she responded with detached confidence. "Teenagers recover from heartbreak. It's not serious. I'm making too much of it." She used the word dramatic once, and the word hit me harder than she intended. I said nothing in return because I feared what might come out if I started. One night, unable to sleep, I walked down the hall and stood outside Mia's room. I could hear her crying, not the sharp, acute kind that comes from a fresh wound, but the slow, exhausted kind that comes from crying the same grief again and again until it becomes a rhythm. I knocked gently, and when she didn't answer, I opened the door. She was curled into herself on the bed, shoulders shaking under the covers. I sat beside her and placed my hand on her back without speaking. After a long moment, she turned and pressed herself against me the way she had as a small child, and I held her while she cried. When she finally found words, she asked me what was wrong with her, why she hadn't been enough. I told her what I believed and still believe, that nothing was wrong with her, that she was whole and valuable and loved, that the failure belonged entirely to Connor. What I didn't tell her was how frightened I was, not just for her, but for the shape our family had taken. A father carrying a daughter's pain alone while his wife scrolled through her phone on the couch downstairs. The loneliness of that arrangement was its own slow wound. 3 weeks after the breakup, I came home one afternoon to find Mia sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands clasped in her lap. She looked up when I entered and spoke 2 words that restructured everything. She was pregnant. The news arrived like a physical impact. I sat down beside her without thinking. We stayed like that for a long time, 2 people trying to absorb something enormous, before I pulled her into my arms and told her as clearly and firmly as I could that she was not going to face this alone. Whatever came next, we would face it together. That vow cost me nothing in the moment and would demand everything in the months that followed.
The evening after Mia told me about her pregnancy, she spent hours trying to reach Connor. She called his number repeatedly, each attempt going straight to voicemail. By the following morning, his number had been blocked. She drove to his apartment complex, something she had never done before, and learned from the building manager that he had vacated the unit quietly the week prior, leaving no forwarding address and no indication of where he had gone. He had disappeared not by accident, but by design. The timing made it clear that Connor had known about the pregnancy before Mia had even confirmed it herself, and he had chosen to vanish rather than face it. She came home and sat at the kitchen table and told me this in a voice so flat and empty that it frightened me more than tears would have. I held my anger carefully in those moments. On the outside, I spoke gently and calmly. I told her that someone who abandoned his responsibilities that completely did not deserve her anguish. On the inside, something harder and colder was forming, a resolve that Connor Walsh would not simply walk away from the wreckage he had helped create. 3 days later, a second crisis arrived with almost no warning. On a Friday evening, I realized that Carla had not come home. At first, I assumed a delayed errand or an evening with a friend. By 10 o'clock, I started calling. Her phone went to voicemail immediately. I called her office, her closest friends, her usual haunts. Nothing. By morning, I had exhausted every reasonable explanation. I drove through the city, checking routes she commonly used. I called 2 hospitals. With Mia standing beside me, pale, already carrying more than a 19-year-old should, I finally called the police and reported my wife missing. What followed was a particular kind of humiliation that I had never anticipated. The officer who took my report was initially professional, but his tone changed when I identified myself as the reporting spouse. He informed me with a directness that felt designed to unsettle that husbands were statistically the first point of inquiry in disappearance cases. I sat at the station answering questions that felt less like investigation and more like accusation. Questions about the state of our marriage, about arguments, about infidelity. By Tuesday of that week, a regional newspaper had picked up the story. The headline was careful and legally neutral, but its implications were unmistakable. It named me without naming me as a suspect, while accomplishing exactly that effect. Neighbors who would wave to me for years now avoided eye contact. Colleagues at the university grew formal and distant. My department chair summoned me to his office and relieved me of my summer course with a phrase I have not forgotten: optics. In the span of 10 days, I lost my wife to disappearance, my reputation to suspicion, my professional standing to institutional caution, and my sense of safety to a world that had already convicted me without evidence. The only thing that kept me functional during this period was Mia. She was frightened and grieving and pregnant, and yet she made coffee in the evenings and sat across the table from me and insisted that we would get through it. She was 19 years old, and she was the steadiest person in my life. I am not sure I have ever been more humbled. 6 weeks after Carla disappeared, a letter arrived. Plain white envelope, no return address. My name written in her handwriting across the front.
I opened it at the kitchen counter, while Mia watched from the doorway. Inside was a single page, the message brief and without apology. She had left because she wanted to. She instructed me not to involve the police further, not to search for her, and not to draw Mia into whatever I was feeling. She signed her name and offered nothing else. No explanation of where she had gone, no acknowledgement of what she was leaving behind, no word about the grandchild Mia was carrying. 4 sentences. That was all she gave us, after 20 years of marriage and a daughter she had raised from infancy. Mia read the letter over my shoulder. She said quietly that her mother had just left us. I folded the letter, put it back in its envelope, and placed it in a drawer because I had no idea what else to do with it. The truth it contained, that Carla had left voluntarily, that she was alive and deliberately absent, released me from the shadow of criminal suspicion, but it replaced that shadow with something colder. Abandonment is a different kind of wound than loss. There is no grief ritual for it, no socially acceptable response. You simply absorb it. During the same period, Mia's doctor recommended prenatal preparation classes. She resisted, saying the setting was designed for couples and she would feel conspicuous attending as a single young woman. I told her I would go with her and that whatever looks we received were other people's problem, not ours. The first evening we attended, I expected to feel out of place. I did, initially, a middle-aged father surrounded by expectant couples sitting on a yoga mat in a fluorescent-lit community center. But the instructor that night changed something in the room the moment she entered. Her name was Dr. Sarah Mendez, a certified midwife with a calm and deliberate manner that made the anxiety in the space quietly recede. When she moved through the room, adjusting postures and checking in with each attendee, she paused beside Mia and said something simple and direct, that strength and support did not require a particular configuration, and that Mia had both. I watched my daughter's posture change in response to those words, a slight loosening of the tension she had been carrying for weeks. In the weeks that followed, Sarah became a steady presence at the margins of our lives. After class, she would check in briefly with Mia about nutrition and rest and emotional state, asking without prying, listening without judgment. One evening, while Mia was speaking with another expectant mother across the room, Sarah turned to me and said I was doing a good job. 5 words. I had not realized how much I needed to hear something like that until the moment it arrived. I did not call what I felt towards Sarah anything for a long time. I was still a married man, technically, and whatever Carla had become, I had not yet formally ended what we had started. But I began to understand that something in me was recognizing steadiness and safety in a new place, and that recognition was real, even if I was not ready to name it. A photograph arrived 3 weeks after Carla's letter, sent by an acquaintance in Charleston who had seen it in a society publication. It showed Carla at a fundraising event, dressed in formal attire, a champagne glass raised, smiling with the ease of someone entirely unburdened by whatever she had left behind. Standing beside her, equally relaxed, was Connor Walsh. The image confirmed what I had not allowed myself to fully suspect. Carla had not simply left our marriage, she had left it for him, the same young man who had walked away from our pregnant daughter without a word. The two of them were now visible and social, apparently without concern for who might see. When Mia saw the photograph, her hands shook. She set it down on the table and did not speak for several minutes. When she finally did, her voice was very quiet and very controlled, which was somehow worse than if she had screamed. I had no adequate response to offer. I sat with her in the kitchen and let her feel what she needed to feel, and I managed my own rage as privately as I could. The last remnant of whatever had connected me to Carla dissolved in that moment. What remained was a clarity that was almost peaceful. I needed to protect Mia, and I needed to eventually make Connor Walsh accountable for what he had done. Mia's pregnancy continued. Sarah's classes continued. Slowly, carefully, we built something resembling a routine. Then, on a Sunday afternoon in late autumn, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Carla standing on the porch. She was polished and composed, dressed in clothes I didn't recognize from our use together, but what stopped my breath was not her appearance. She was holding a newborn. She introduced the infant as Ethan and told us with a casualness that bordered on incomprehensible that he was hers. Mia had come downstairs carrying her own daughter. She had named her Clara and was standing on the steps when Carla said the name of Ethan's father, Connor. The impact on Mia was immediate and physical. She gripped the railing, her knees visibly weakening. She asked her mother in a voice that broke in 3 places how this was possible, how any of it was possible. Carla reached toward her. Mia stepped back. I stood between them and felt a fury so complete and so cold that it was almost calm. Carla had not only betrayed her marriage, she had taken from her own daughter the person Mia had loved, and she had returned with evidence of that betrayal bundled in a blanket in her arms. The damage was not abstract or distant, it was standing in our living room, and it had a name. I told Carla with as much restraint as I could assemble that she needed to leave. She protested. She spoke about family, about the connection between the 2 infants, about moving forward. I told her again that she needed to leave. After a long moment, she did. Mia sat on the stairs for a long time after that. Clara cried. I sat beside my daughter and held both of them as best I could. I did not tell her that everything would be fine because I was not certain it would be. I told her only that she was not alone and that I intended to make sure Connor Walsh could not simply continue his life as though none of this had consequences.
Carla did not stay away after that first afternoon. She returned within the week, initially for brief visits and then for longer ones, and eventually with an unspoken expectation that she might resume some role within the household. She brought Ethan with her on each occasion. The dynamic she seemed to be proposing, that we could simply reconfigure around the reality of what had happened and move forward as an altered but functional unit, was one that neither Mia nor I had any interest in accepting. The tension between them was constant and exhausting. Mia was fiercely protective of Clara and made no effort to conceal her contempt for the position Carla had placed them all in. Carla, for her part, maintained a composure that read less as maturity and more as indifference to the pain she had caused. Their exchanges were brief and brittle, and I found myself mediating without the energy or authority to actually resolve anything. Carla's presence in the house was its own kind of damage. Every room she entered carried the weight of what she had done, and I could not sustain the performance of civility for long. At the same time, I was aware that removing her entirely was not something I could accomplish unilaterally while she was caring for an infant, and Ethan, whatever else was true about the circumstances of his birth, was innocent of all of it. I began spending more time outside the house during those weeks. I drove aimlessly sometimes, passing through neighborhoods where the community center was located, where Sarah held her sessions. I was not looking for her exactly, but her steadiness had become a reference point for me. A reminder that the world I had known before all of this, where people were calm and kind and present, still existed somewhere. My focus during this period began to settle on Connor. The more I examined the sequence of events, his courtship of Mia, his abrupt disappearance, his subsequent involvement with Carla, the 2 children left in his wake, the more clearly I understood that I was not dealing with someone who had made a series of impulsive mistakes. I was dealing with someone who had treated other people's lives as raw material for his own advancement. Late at night, I began searching for him systematically. Law school databases, alumni networks, social media platforms. I found traces of him across several channels, enough to construct a rough picture of where he was and what he was doing. What I eventually found stopped me completely. A photograph appeared on a mutual contact's public profile. Connor, in formal attire, at what appeared to be an engagement announcement. The woman beside him was identified in the caption as Ashley Hargrove, Raymond Hargrove's younger daughter, Carla's sister. I sat with that information for a long time. Connor had not simply walked away from our family. He had positioned himself to walk directly into the Hargrove estate through the side door, leveraging every connection he had made along the way. He had seduced my daughter, entered into a relationship with my wife, and was now preparing to marry into the family that had once dismissed me as unworthy. The calculation behind it was remarkable in its audacity and in its complete disregard for every person it used along the way.
Whatever I had felt before, anger, grief, helplessness, reconfigured in that moment into something more focused. Connor Walsh was not simply going to disappear into a comfortable future. I would not allow it.
Once I understood what Connor was doing, the family he was marrying into, the protection that union would provide him, the complete absence of any accountability for what he had left behind in Austin, I stopped sleeping well. I lay awake measuring what I had against what he had, and the imbalance was almost laughable. He had money, connections, a family of status about to formally receive him. I had a folder of medical documents, a daughter trying to raise a child alone, and a name that was still recovering from a season of public suspicion. I told myself that the only weapon I had left was the truth, and that the only place the truth would do any real damage was in front of the people who were currently celebrating Connor as a worthy addition to their world. I gathered everything I could locate that documented the reality of what he had done. Mia's prenatal records, Clara's birth certificate, a timeline of events I had constructed from memory and from whatever digital traces Connor had left across the months. I assembled these into a folder, added a few photographs that documented his public appearances with Carla, and kept it all in my car. I also, in a moment of fury I have since examined carefully, purchased a replica firearm from a second-hand shop on the edge of the city. It was not because I intended to harm anyone. What I wanted was presence, the kind of physical authority that commands a room's attention long enough for words to land. A lone man with a folder of documents would be escorted out before he reached a microphone. I needed 60 seconds of silence. I also carried a hunting knife. I recognize how this reads. I want to be honest about the state I was in. One evening, as I was loading my car, Mia appeared in the doorway with Clara in her arms. Sarah was standing behind her. They had both seen enough to ask questions I could not easily answer. Sarah stepped forward and told me directly that I would not survive what I was planning, not literally, but in every way that mattered. She told me that Mia and Clara needed me present and intact, not imprisoned or destroyed. Mia cried. I promised them both that I would not do anything reckless. I kept that promise technically and violated its spirit entirely. I waited until the house was quiet, until Mia was asleep and Sarah had gone home. Then I took the bag I had prepared, got in my car, and drove east toward Charleston. The drive took most of the night. I had time to reconsider. I did not. I arrived in the city as the sun was coming up and waited through the morning in a rented room reviewing what I had assembled, rehearsing what I intended to say. By early evening, I drove to the address I had found for the Hargrove estate. The wedding was already underway when I arrived. I parked down the street, adjusted my jacket, and walked toward the lights. I was not calm, but I was deliberate. Whatever happened next, I had made peace with the fact that I was no longer willing to be a bystander to a story that had destroyed my family while its architect walked free and celebrated. The Hargrove estate was exactly what I had imagined from the years I had spent in Carla's stories about her upbringing. Grand, immaculate, designed to communicate wealth through every architectural detail. Chandeliers visible through tall windows, catering staff moving in organized patterns, guests in formal attire filling the courtyard and reception hall. The kind of event that announces itself as important before anyone inside has said a word. I entered through a side access point, dressed in a suit I had borrowed from a colleague's spare wardrobe, and moved toward the back of the main reception hall. The ceremony had concluded. The reception was mid-toast when I arrived. Raymond Hargrove stood at the front of the room with a raised glass, speaking about family legacy and the meaning of commitment. From the back of the room, I could see Connor clearly. He stood beside Ashley in a tailored tuxedo, smiling with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Carla was seated near the front, Ethan in her lap. She had not seen me yet. I moved through the crowd during the applause that followed Raymond's toast. I reached the platform at the front of the room before anyone thought to question what I was doing there. I stepped up, placed my hand on the microphone, and spoke. I introduced myself simply as someone the assembled guests deserved to hear from.
I stated that the man they were celebrating had fathered 2 children in the preceding year, one with my daughter, who was 19 and was now raising that child without his involvement, and one with his mistress, who was also present in the room. I stated his name clearly, and I stated theirs. The room's response was immediate and layered. Ashley turned toward Connor with an expression that cycled through confusion, recognition, and devastation in the span of a few seconds. Raymond's glass lowered. Carla went still. Connor's smile collapsed. I had brought documentation with me. I placed the folder on the nearest table. The medical records, the birth documents, the timeline. I announced that I intended to pursue formal paternity recognition and financial accountability through the appropriate legal channels, and that the assembled guests were now in possession of the same information I was. Then I reached into my jacket and produced the replica firearm. I want to be clear about what happened next, because the accounts that circulated afterward were not entirely accurate. I did not threaten anyone specifically. I raised the object in a way that commanded the room's complete attention for approximately 60 seconds, during which no one moved and Connor did not attempt to leave. I then lowered it, opened the chamber visibly so anyone watching could confirm it was empty, and placed it on the table beside the documents. I told the room I had come for truth, not violence, that the object was a prop, that the real weapon on the table was the documentation, which was entirely real. Ashley removed her ring. Connor, surrounded on all sides by people who now understood what he had done, sank into himself. Raymond's fury turned outward, but also, I sensed, inward, toward his own complicity in welcoming someone without truly examining his character. Carla sat motionless in the front row, holding Ethan, unable to move in any direction that didn't implicate her further. I gathered what I needed from the table, turned from the room, and walked out into the Charleston evening. Behind me, the celebration had become something else entirely. Ahead of me, for the first time in many months, the weight I had been carrying felt slightly different. By the time I returned to Austin, the story had already traveled ahead of me. Coverage appeared across regional and national platforms within hours of the event. The framing varied. Some accounts described me as reckless, others as a father who had refused to allow his family's destruction to go unaddressed. The public, for the most part, landed somewhere in the second category. The image of a man who had been labeled a criminal suspect, stripped of his professional position and left to raise a grieving daughter alone, and who had ultimately driven across the state to make the truth visible, resonated in ways I had not anticipated. Connor Walsh's engagement dissolved within days. The legal processes I had announced at the reception were not empty declarations. I followed through on every one. Paternity proceedings were initiated for both Clara and Ethan. Connor, facing the full weight of what he had constructed, had no credible position from which to deny any of it. Raymond Hargrove's public standing suffered considerably. Society coverage that once celebrated his family now questioned his role in the scandal. Businesses created distance. Invitations slowed. His name appeared in contexts he had not chosen and could not control. Carla's circumstances shifted as well. The Hargrove family refused to extend support after the wedding collapse. She had aligned herself entirely with someone whose credibility was in ruins, and that alignment had consequences. She found herself isolated in ways she had perhaps not anticipated. Ethan remained in her care. What she built from that point was hers alone to construct. For Mia and me, the weeks that followed were quiet in a way that felt hard-earned. She was still healing. There were mornings when grief surfaced unexpectedly, when Clara's cries carried extra weight. But there was also laughter, slow and genuine. We took walks in the neighborhood with Clara in the stroller, and people who had previously avoided our eyes began to stop and speak. Sarah was a constant through all of it. She arrived when needed, brought practical support without drama, held Clara when Mia needed sleep, and sat with me on the porch on evenings when silence was more comfortable than conversation. I did not rush what was developing between us. There had been enough rushing. I let it arrive at its own pace, and when it did, it felt nothing like the fire I had once confused for love. It felt like ground beneath my feet. I sat alone many nights and asked myself honestly whether I had handled things correctly. The answer was almost certainly no, not in every particular. The theater of Charleston, the terror I had caused innocent guests, these were not things I could justify cleanly, and I did not try. What I could say was that my daughter was no longer alone, that Clara had legal standing, and that Connor was no longer sheltered by silence or a powerful family's approval. I held Clara one evening and whispered into her soft hair that I would protect her for as long as I was able, and that she would never have to face the world without someone standing beside her. That vow was not forged in anger. It was something simpler and more durable, and it was enough for now to begin again.